That's my interview with Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. China and the U.S. ties is not just about any bilateral relationship. Since they are the world's two largest economies, this relationship is the backbone to international trade, but also adds more challenges, some say, to the reform of the systems. On the sidelines of the China Development Forum, I also spoke to Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow working on the international trade policy and economic sanctions at the Peterson Institute for International Economics based in Washington, D.C. He discussed the global trading system from an American viewpoint and see how the bilateral relations is having its impact on the reform of the WTO. Let's take a look. There are so many things on the agenda for the world regarding trade. For example, the reform of the WTO. Are we going to see different parallels of interaction between China and the United States at this moment, or the trade talk will totally absorb all the energy of the two countries?
The dispute settlement problem is a limited one. The appellate body will not be operative after December 11th. But that doesn't mean that the WTO cannot adjudicate disputes, and it will have the ability to issue rulings. Those rulings will not be able to be appealed. And so other countries can do workarounds. The European Union and Canada and other countries have been developing sort of parallel type of appellate processes.
But very small scale because the members involved over there.
Yeah, but it wouldn't apply to cases involving the United States.
Yes.
And that's where the discrimination and the dysfunction comes in. But the more important issue, and I mean, that's critical, and it has to be resolved because you have to have the United States be subject to enforcement. But the critical problem, which critically involves China and the United States, is that you can't update the rules unless China and the United States participate in that process and buy into that process and contribute to it. And if you don't have an updating of the rules, then more and more areas of commercial conflict will be unenforceable under the trading rules and will lead politicians to take extra legal actions, as we've seen by both the United States and the Chinese government.
Right. So are we going to see anything that's likely to happen in terms of WTO, or are we going to see more practices like what Canada and some of the European countries have been doing, which is having smaller scale dispute settlement rules and body of their own, and therefore the future of the WTO probably is pretty much hanging in the air, Mr. Schott?
Well, there is a lot of work going on in the United States, some in Europe, and also quite a bit here in China on what is needed and how to update the WTO rulebook, which essentially been intact and unreformed for 25 years. That, I think, is very difficult to do with a U.S. administration that does not give priority to multilateral negotiations, or even plurilateral, where a group of countries would get together to try to develop new rules. I think another U.S. administration more committed to updating and reinforcing the multilateral trading system could find common cause with China on a number of important areas of international commerce that needs more discipline.
How much do you think there is the possibility of the United States unwillingly at this moment, in terms of the administration's view, to participate further in the WTO reform discussion? The other economies will team up, not just one or two or three, but rather in a bigger scale, be able to come up with something of their own, and the U.S. being left alone. Now, that's also another possibility some have been talking about.
I don't think it's.
Are you worried about that?
I'm not worried about it because they're at least thinking constructively, but not in a very practical manner. Because to have the system work or the new rules be effective, they have to apply to the United States and China.
Yeah.
And to have a system of rules that excludes the United States is effectively giving the United States a free ride and allowing us to continue to pursue extra-legal activities. That doesn't help us, and it certainly doesn't help the integrity of the multilateral system.
What about that early October engagement again between the two negotiation teams? Should we have much expectation for that?
Well, I think both sides want to find a way to put a deal together to avoid hurting each other and hurting themselves. And the pain will just get worse and worse if we follow through with the threats to impose more tariffs by the end of this year. So the opportunity to sit down and talk and perhaps even negotiate a ceasefire would be beneficial.
Now, at this moment, Mr. Schott, many believe, both sides still believe that they have an upper hand against each other, given the latest changes in economy picture. And then there's also the issue of the election. Well, at the same time, there seems to be a lot of lack of trust going on, particularly about the credibility issue, given some earlier agreements being somewhat hammered out and yet not necessarily being respected by either of the sides. So can we really expect any kinds of result? What are the two sides, when they're talking to each other, can depend on to hold on to some dim hope of the deal?
Well, there has been growing mistrust of each other during the course of the negotiations. And it's not just because of the natural up and downs of a negotiating process.
No.
That occurs in every negotiation. And sometimes you have to have a temporary failure to achieve a success afterwards. But what I think is more difficult to manage is that the scope of the friction has expanded. And so before we were talking about a set of trade issues. Now we are talking about that and high technology trade and investment that is of a different nature. And so that has deepened the divide between the two countries and has also gotten the attention of advisors more concerned with national security than with economic performance. And so within each country, I think there is tension in the decision-making process on how much one impairs your own economy to defend what is perceived as national security interests.
Talking about the technology, Mr. Schott, since there's a key word there, Huawei has been an important thorny issue between China and U.S. Now, without much evidence, now the U.S. has sidelined Huawei, and also it seems that there has been enormous amount of difficulties for Huawei to continue its already existing operation, despite of its deals and agreements with the rural operators inside the United States. So how are we going to witness the future trend of this important case study?
Well, some of it we don't have because of the legal process. Some of it we don't have because of the national security concerns or the charges of impairment of national security. We know it will lead to disruptions, particularly, as you mentioned, in rural communities in the United States. And it will lead to some adjustments in supply chains. Huawei has a lot of suppliers from U.S. high technology firms.
But that's a national security issue, isn't it, in a way, that once you put that into a framework of so-called national security, there seems to be a lot of lack of information for anyone from outside the circle to have a judgment about the issue, and therefore make all the scholars and experts and people who know the trade difficult to get engaged and discuss and provide suggestions. Mr. Schott, I'm sure it's not just one case or two. How do you, as a trade expert, going to see this trend? Maybe there's Huawei, there's more to come, not just with China, maybe with other countries too.
Well, we were talking about restoring trust in our bilateral trade negotiations. I think there is an element that the Trump administration has to restore trust in its assessment of national security concerns. Because like the story of the boy who cried wolf, he cried wolf all the times when there wasn't a real emergency, and then when the emergency came, no one believed him because he had always cried wolf under less compelling circumstances. We have now seen the Trump administration cry wolf over national security concerns about steel and aluminum and automobiles. It is undermining the credibility of the national security determinations and at least raising doubts about the veracity of the charges. And so there has to be renewed confidence that when our leaders say this is important for national security and has to take precedence over everything else, that we regard it as credible and not just a political gesture.
Many people feel pessimistic about the short term. From a trade expert's perspective, how would you be able to pick up yourself every morning and still be able to try to provide solutions to many of the difficult problems we touch on?
The first thing is there is extensive concern all over the world, not just in Washington and Beijing, but in many, many other countries, about understanding the nature of the U.S.-China conflict and finding ways of helping to resolve it when the two largest trading nations are in conflict and everyone else is being hurt by it. And I'm heartened by the fact that so many people are concerned, not only about the ramifications for their own country, but what the United States and China not working together means for the international system. And I think there are many people in both our countries that recognize that we have a responsibility. Bob Zoellick years ago called it responsible stakeholder for China, because he assumed naturally that the U.S. was a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Now I think we have to say both China and the United States have to be responsible stakeholders.
If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and the world. And do enjoy both the weekend and the Mid-Autumn Festival. Bye for now.